The right is not a singular cohesive faction. There are divides across ideological, regional, and religious lines that in some cases are nearly as irreconcilable as the differences between the broad right and left. We often hear about Christian nationalism in the United States as a major faction or facet of right-wing circles, but it too isn't a singular movement, having two large and separate Catholic and Protestant segments, or perhaps more so high church and low church segments, as in my experience Catholics, Anglicans, Episcopals, Orthodox, and Mormons tend to work closest together with each other, while low church non-denominationals, Baptists, Methodists, and Calvinists find closer kinship with each other, Lutherans typically falling between the two factions but generally leaning toward the latter. And these groups can be friendly and civil with one another, but do hold extremely contrasting visions for the United States that stem from deeply rooted religious and social values that both sides are extremely resistant to compromise on. And if it came down to a matter of power, these factions at present would easily sabotage and turn against each other to ensure they emerge as the dominant group on the right. The faction most eager for rebellion and secession is easily the low church faction, and it is largely synonymous with the rural South and Plains region. Ideologically, this region of the country is a hotbed for self-proclaimed American nationalists. It is a major hub, if not the hub, of Protestant Christian nationalism, and it is perhaps the most densely conservative contiguous region of the country, and much like the South during the First Civil War, it again wants either to have national policy its own way, or to break away and be left alone. Much like in the case of Yugoslav nationalism, American nationalism does not truly exist in a practical sense outside of being an ambition for control or domination in a union led by the proponent of said nationalism. In the case of Yugoslavia, this was Serbia, and in the case of America, this is the South. When people speak of American nationalism, they'll espouse values like states' rights, constitutionalism, small government, capitalism, maybe even just general anti-modernism or anti-urbanism. All hallmarks of Southern-style Jeffersonian philosophy that show through and define this faction, but which the high church faction simply does not align with. Ask a real Catholic conservative his vision of American nationalism, and it'll probably entail centralized authority, significantly amending the Constitution or even repealing older amendments, using government power to provide more for the people, regulating business to enforce a strict America First economy, not an international economy, and investing in the improvement of northern urban and suburban communities that most of this population inhabits. Conservative Catholic Latinos across the Southwest are a whole different demographic as well, but generally align with this, and assuredly enough you'll find the other high church faiths identifying more strongly with this line of policy than the former. Geography has been a major influence on both of these factions, as the low church faction is arguably more isolated from the core left-wing urban centers, whilst the high church faction being brought up among them is more familiar with left-wing policy firsthand, and in some ways has had their attitudes tempered, yet in other ways have become far more ideologically radicalized than their low church counterparts. As a tangent, I'd point out that in the event of a civil war where these factions manage to put aside their differences and successfully coalesce, high churches would probably make excellent generals and strategists familiar with how the opponent thinks, while low churches would make superior soldiers with more survival and potentially combat experience. But I doubt either side would trust the other enough to allow for this type of specialization. Further, if we circle back to a scenario of right-wing rebels attempting to endure a federal onslaught deep within their own territory with the goal of seceding, this would exclude a massive swath of right-wingers living within left-wing states. Why should a conservative New Yorker die so that South Carolina can be free? Why should a conservative from Chicago die for Texas? They're not the same state, they're not the same people, they're not even the same type of conservative. It's like expecting a Shia in Iran to fight a war on behalf of the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia just because they're both conservative Muslims. And this is just speaking on the broad groups within Christian nationalism specifically, which in all fairness does overlap with regional identities quite well, but this isn't even covering the diversity of ideology within the American right. You have conservatives who will disregard faith in the name of economics, conservatives who will disregard economics in the name of government structure, economics, and faith in the name of ethnicity. The list goes on. None of these factions are going to compromise their own positions for the positions of another faction because many of them won't even consider each other real conservatives. In the minds of many of these factions, their one ideology is the truest form of conservatism and everyone else is more leftist to some degree. So of course they deserve to lead, they deserve to win, and if that means all the other right-wingers don't get what they want, so be it. But they don't realize almost every other faction is thinking the exact same way about them, and thus all the conservatives throw each other under the bus. Factions aside, let's talk about trust. A lot of conservatives lack it and can demonstrate a massive paranoia in its place. Psychologically, this makes sense. The conservative mindset is rooted in survival and to a degree fear, and heightened paranoia should be expected to go along with that. I have a whole video about that right here. Now, there are probably already in this very comment section several comments saying Fed this, Fed that, which in this context doesn't even make sense because I'm opposed to civil conflict. You see, in conservative circles, everyone but you is a Fed, and everything that seems like a legitimate right-wing movement that isn't yours, that's just a Fed trap. And anything you see online or in the media that isn't exactly what you believe is planted by a Fed. The right is extremely quick to label others within their own ranks as feds or federal agents attempting to entrap them into doing something illegal. This speaks a great degree to not only the right's unwillingness to take action at risk of potential consequences, but to their general distrust of one another. I've spoken to one group of right-wingers who call another group feds, I've spoken to the right-wingers in that group who called my initial group feds, repeat that interaction a dozen times over across several different groups, maybe swapping the term fed with controlled opposition or grifter or any other number of terms, and the pattern became clear. As far as I could see, all of these groups and their members appeared sincere and genuinely believed what they espoused, maybe save for a few who seemed either to just be along for the ride or more interested in personal gain than actual political change. But nonetheless, normal people involved in politics, mostly just wanting things to get better in their own way. And yet, there was a terrible amount of distrust between groups, which so often stemmed from a misunderstanding of each other, and almost a lack of belief that anyone who had conservative views distinct from their own could be authentic. You have so many right-wingers who wouldn't even trust each other enough to go to one another's events, protests, heck, even signing petitions. And yet we're supposed to expect that suddenly every faction of the right is going to come together at just the right time and trust each other as legitimate movements? Let's be frank here. You could have a well-organized militia movement actually making significant gains in some kind of rebellion and sending out videos or messages trying to get other right-wingers to join them. Some conservative, probably with his own stockpile of guns and prepper supplies, would just dismiss it, thinking to himself, "Ha! Nice try, Fed." The last major point I'll touch on is drive. Just how much do conservatives actually want to fight? How many are actually willing to fight? You hear a lot of grandstanding and a lot of big talk, but what do actions say? When a state, county, or neighborhood becomes too left-wing, too democratic, how do right-wingers respond? Do they make moves to reassert control over their communities, their homes, for many of them the places they have spent the majority of their lives? No. They run away to somewhere more comfortable, somewhere safe, to a little red area where they don't need to fight. There seems to be this amorphous moment in the mind of many on the right that at some point, the government is just going to go too far and conservatives everywhere will rise up to challenge and take back power. But similarly to conservative end goals in a civil war, the lack of clarity on where that line is drawn does not inspire confidence in conservative chances of successful mobilization. The point some conservatives will make is, when they finally come for our guns, that is when we will know they have gone too far. And if that truly is the too far line, there is very little hope for American conservatism, period. In the United States, the right makes some very bold claims. The right will say, the government has facilitated one of the largest genocides in history by allowing abortion. And this isn't too far? The right will say that Trump was cheated out of an election victory and the system is corrupt. And that's not too far. The right says that COVID was a conspiracy to poison us and take away our freedoms. And that's not too far. The right says children are being mutilated, we are being replaced, our religion is being suppressed. And none of this is too far. Oh, but my guns, that's sacred. That's when we'll finally wake up. I don't think so. The line of too far was crossed a long time ago and conservatives have done nothing, because they lack the drive to fight. Try to think back to an incident of large numbers of right-wingers in the United States coming together to commit violence. If January 6th is the best example you can think of, the right really doesn't stand a chance. What do they even think this is going to look like? That one day the government is just going to send squads of feds to conservative houses to take their guns and they're going to fight them off Ruby Ridge style? What you'll probably see is some gun buyback program for semi-autos and certain types of rifles, and after that program is done, they'll start fining people, and some people might resist that, but most are eventually going to cave when the bills get too high, and finally surrender their guns then. And the few people who let their fines get way too high, well, that's when police will probably put out a warrant for their arrest, or the government might just move to seize their assets, which most people would probably opt to fight in court instead of fight with their guns. So, no. Even stricter gun control won't be enough to motivate a Civil War-sized rebellion. I'll grant this much, the 2024 election does take many right-wing concerns and bundles them into a single event that can rally the right. Whether your concern is gun control, immigration, freedom of speech, religion, abortion, what have you, the election outcome is going to impact that. And this is why the election could actually spark conflict, and I do believe there is a strong possibility for that. But the right isn't explosive. The right burns and fizzles very quickly, which is why I believe that even if rebellion broke out, it would lack the drive and momentum to carry on for very long. Conservatives can barely stand up for their own beliefs in small ways, let alone when life and limb are on the line. How many conservatives are afraid to admit that they voted for Donald Trump in public, to their coworkers or friends or families? How many conservatives are afraid to talk about their personal beliefs because they're afraid to offend or to be cancelled? How many conservatives cave to the pressure they're put under by the rest of society? And we're supposed to expect that enough of them are going to raise up arms against the most powerful country on the planet. People talk about how China is a paper dragon, but American conservatism is a paper elephant. American conservatives can be best analogized as a meek husband who complains about his abusive wife and swears up and down that he's going to leave her any day now, but isn't man enough to do it. Nor is he man enough or smart enough to reassert dominance in the relationship.